It's Friday, November 14th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 770 days old. I'm FDD Senior Research Analyst Natalie Ecanow, filling in for Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Today's guest is Zaaimi, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, not to mention an alumna of FDD's National Security Network. Sarah is an award-winning journalist with decades of experience working on issues related to the Middle East and North Africa, including Arab-Israeli normalization. She and I will discuss Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's upcoming trip to Washington and what's new with the Abraham Accords in a few short moments. But first, I want to tell you about a video that caught my eye as I was scrolling social media the other day. I'm not talking about the one of Trump sharing his favorite cologne with Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara in the Oval Office, although if you haven't seen that one, it's a gem. I'm talking about clips of Palestinians from Gaza touching down in South Africa. Yesterday, about 150 Gazans landed in South Africa after a 24-plus-hour journey that took them from Gaza to Eilat to Nairobi, Kenya, and finally to Johannesburg. When the group arrived at their final destination, authorities denied them entry for several hours. Accusations started flying about lack of exit stamps. Fingers wagged at Israel. Now, I'm not in a position to comment on airport procedures or whether the delay was warranted, but I am in a position to point out the irony of this whole debacle. For starters, South Africa is the country that brought the genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. If South Africa wholeheartedly believed that Gazans faced genocide back at home, you'd think it'd be a little more welcoming and let bureaucratic issues take a back seat. The thing is, the ICJ case isn't a blip. South Africa's dominant political party has been chummy with Hamas for decades. Not even Hamas's October 7th murder spree could spoil the friendship. I mean, South Africa's foreign minister hopped on a call with Hamas Nick-in-Chief Ismail Haniyeh just 10 days after the massacre. We're not dealing with Nelson Mandela's South Africa, but a South Africa that's part of what your regular host likes to call the axis of enablers, nominal U.S. allies that enable Hamas terrorism. You can probably guess who else is part of that crew, but since John's not here to say it, I will. It's the Qataris and the Turks, so that's 3 bees in our bonnets that keep on buzzing. And now for your headlines. Headline 1. The U.S. Treasury Department imposed sanctions on over 24 targets that support Iran's ballistic missile and drone production networks. To be exact, Treasury sanctioned 32 individuals and entities, and this was quite the international package with targets based in Iran, mainland China, Hong Kong, the United Arab Emirates, Turkey, India, and Germany. Iran is trying to rebuild the capabilities it lost during the 12-day war with Israel in June, and this group of 32 are trying their darndest to help. They've been procuring things like missile propellant precursors and helping Tehran access the U.S. financial system. That, of course, is a big no-no. Treasury's action is part of the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign against Iran, not to mention a critical follow-up to the UN sanctions that snapped back in late September. In fact, this is Treasury's second round of non-proliferation sanctions since the snapback. And as John would say, keep it coming. Headline 2. U.S. Central Command provided an update on operational activity in Syria. Here's the rundown. Between October 1st and November 6th, American troops helped carry out over 22 operations against ISIS in Syria, during which 5 ISIS operatives were killed and 19 captured. And U.S. forces aren't going to pat themselves on the back, pack up, and go home. CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper said that troops will continue to, quote, aggressively pursue ISIS remnants in Syria, end quote. To be sure, CENTCOM isn't going at it alone. The U.S. is working with the global coalition to defeat ISIS to ensure that these recent wins stick. Here's the craziest bit. Syria itself announced earlier this week that it's joining the global coalition against ISIS. Yes, the Syria headed by an ex-Al-Qaeda leader is now fighting the good fight against ISIS. What a world. And headline 3, Israeli forces dismantled a Hamas network in the West Bank. Yesterday, the IDF and Shin Bet announced a major counterterrorism success. Israeli forces arrested approximately 50 terrorists across 15 recent operations. The network, which was operating in and around Bethlehem, was planning a series of shooting and bombing attacks against Israeli targets. Meanwhile, the IDF eliminated 2 terrorists yesterday near the Israeli community of Karmei Tzor. The pair was en route to execute an attack. The West Bank remains hot, you guys, and the IDF is prepping for worst-case scenario. On Wednesday, troops completed a readiness exercise that simulated multiple terrorist attacks akin to Hamas's October 7th assault. All right, it's now time for my conversation with Zaaimi, non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Without further ado, let's bring her on. Welcome to the Morning Brief, Zaaimi.
Hello, Natalie.
Hi, so I want to talk about this Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's upcoming visit to Washington. He's set to arrive next week, and it's going to be his first visit, as I understand it, in over 7 years. So before we dive into what's coming up, can you just give us a sense of what's changed between the last time MBS was here and now?
Yeah, that's a very important question. The Saudi Arabia of 2018, when MBS came to meet Trump 1.0 administration, is very different from the Saudi Arabia of today. First of all, Saudi Arabia has since normalized relations with Iran with a Chinese mediation. So the narrative, the main narrative on which normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia was built is no longer, there. So Iran is no longer really the boogeyman for Saudi Arabia as such, although we know that strategically it is still an enemy. But that makes them more comfortable in negotiations. A second thing is, I think Saudi Arabia has grown demystified from the ephemeral US theocracy. So they know whatever is going to be negotiated with Trump might not last if a democratic administration comes next. And they're very aware of that. And as such, they have diversified their alliances since, for example, or more notably, by joining BRICS. So both UAE and Saudi Arabia now are members of the BRICS. Yet, I must say that Saudi Arabia still sees the US as their main strategic ally because the relationship with the US is an existential one. We know that the current monarch is growing weaker, and they strongly need the United States to ensure a smooth throne transition for MBS. Also, they do need the US for big picture alliances, for ensuring Vision 2030 is gonna be fulfilled for Saudi Arabia's ambitions to diversify away from the oil economy. So a lot has changed, but many things still remain, constant.
So obviously, as you just said, a lot of things have changed since 2018, both on the economic front, the security front. And I think there's been a lot of speculation in the media in the run up to this upcoming visit about what exactly is going to happen, what agreements are going to be signed. Can you just give our audience a sense of what we can expect from MBS's visit next week?
Yeah, sure. I think we saw many headlines about Saudi Arabia wanting to have a Qatar-like defense pact, especially after what we saw in September, the US signing an executive order to allow Qatar to have fighter jets based in Idaho, which is an abomination, if you ask me my opinion, and a national security threat for the US. But understanding the logic of where Saudi Arabia sees itself geopolitically, they would seek something more. They wouldn't want to be on the same foot as Qatar. They would have to go further and get something more from that. But again, I think an advanced security agreement is definitely going to be an outcome of this. A second thing is really to have a roadmap for a permanent solution for Gaza. I think Saudi Arabia still sees itself as the big brother of the Arab world, and they want to get the credit for whatever is going to happen for the future of Gaza. Also, we need to situate this in the power competition between Saudi Arabia, UAE, over some strategic, cases like what's happening in Sudan. We saw in the build up to this meeting, there was a meeting between Rubio and Saudi officials, where we saw Rubio kind of flip his discourse about Sudan and what's happening in Sudan. So I see Saudi Arabia would try to have a US backup for the current Sudanese government, which is another pressing matter on the agenda. And then obviously we also the pledge of the 600 billion during the Trump visit, and we know that 6 months later we haven't seen much of that pledge. So I think this could be a good opportunity. There are rumors about a US-Saudi Business Council meeting happening on the 19th. So maybe we'll see a more concrete, action plan in terms of what that would look like. And again, I think the Saudis also see a lot of momentum building around microchips and AI race, and they would want to have a seat at the table on that as well.
So you mentioned Sudan, which I think is really interesting. There are all these peripheral conflicts going on, or they're actually not peripheral, they're major conflicts. They're just not what we speak about a lot at this program and on this program, and also they're not in the headlines very much. And I think another one of those conflicts is Yemen. And so you mentioned sort of this like disagreement or tension between the Saudis and the Emiratis about Sudan. Is there going to be any impact on Yemen? What are the outcomes of next week's meetings going to have on these sort of other regional conflicts that are going on?
Yes, and I think we tend to think that the Gulf, we keep talking on the media or in the think tank sphere about the Gulf, but actually it's a very heterogeneous, like countries. These countries often don't align so much on some of these peripheral conflicts, as you said. Sudan is one, Libya is another one, Yemen obviously is another one, Ethiopia, Horn of Africa. All of these regions and conflicts, we see that there is a real power competition between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Let's see what the US will choose to do, because from one side, there is a real humanitarian issue in Sudan and real threats from the Houthis that need to be addressed. But from another side, there are like complex allegiances and interests with the UAE and Israel on those issues as well, which means that the US will have to tread very carefully in terms of what they say and what they do in terms of dealing with those issues.
So obviously, I think a major elephant in the room during these conversations is Saudi-Israel normalization, sort of this long-anticipated agreement. It seemed like progress was being made towards that before October 7th. Things got derailed after October 7th. But now we're seeing the momentum pick up again. I mean, yesterday there were reports that Trump had called MBS within the last month and basically encouraged him to normalize relations by the end of 2025. Do you think that's realistic? What's it gonna take to make that happen? Are we gonna see any movement next week? Where are we on that file?
I read your primer about this, and I think that's something that needs to be at the top of the agenda of the Trump administration during this meeting. Saudi Arabia is the crown jewel of the Arab world because of their symbolic presence and the fact that they are in a very holy land. So a normalization will be hugely symbolic. And it might bring together other countries in the sphere of influence of Saudi Arabia, especially Pakistan, for example, to start with, which will solve a huge problem for everyone who is looking for a pan-Abrahamic future for the region. But I feel like we have moved from this obsession of a Saudi normalization. You remember, like maybe in 2020, 2021, 2022, like every week, we would get like, oh, we are getting closer to a normalization deal. And then we realized that that wasn't realistic. I feel the Trump administration right now is more realistic about what a timeline for that would look like. And I think Saudi Arabia, being the new Saudi Arabia, not the 2018 Saudi Arabia, they're much more transactional and pragmatic, and they will not be content with what UAE got back then in terms of transaction. So they are looking at, ambitious things in exchange of that normalization. They are looking even at like a nuclear program. They are looking at a Palestinian state, obviously the defense pact that we spoke about. So I feel like it will be challenging to say that something might be announced during this actual visit, but for sure it will be one of the headlines on the negotiation table. But let me just add something else. I think MBS himself, who's someone who cares a lot about his image as a reformist, as a modernist person, needs to have the historical courage, to take this step for the future of the whole region, to combat all the extremist narratives and build a better future for everyone there. If they aspire to be the leaders of the Arab world, I think it's only logical that MBS should have the courage to take this step.
So I want to pause on the Abraham Accords for a moment and zoom out on Gulf policy in general. Trump's first trip abroad this term was to the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar. And so that, first foreign trip signals that this region is going to be a priority for him. Where do you think our Gulf policy is heading? Is it all heading in one direction? Are we pursuing different lines of effort with regard to different countries? And do you think we're going in the right direction?
I think the Trump administration was smart enough to look at the map and see that, Europe is no longer our biggest ally. It's a decaying empire, a falling empire. You just need to look at the numbers. While the future does look like the Gulf will be one of the pillars of this administration and these alliances. When you look in terms of investment capital potential, for example, when you look in terms of stable monarchies, or what Trump calls like the good dictator club. So they do fulfill many of these criterias, and they do have a big role to play in the stabilization of the Middle East, in the peace effort, in the Abraham Accords, obviously, but also in the stabilization of the oil markets, especially now that Russia is out of the way, Iran is sanctioned, and Venezuela is also like troublesome. So we do need the Gulf as a strategic ally. But that being said, because of the complexity I explained, where the Gulf is not like a one block, they are like different bits and pieces with different interests. I think the US is smart enough to move beyond the logic of alliances to the logic of alignment. So you will see the US align on some things with Saudi Arabia and not align with UAE, and then align with UAE, not with Saudi Arabia. So I think the policy is moving into a less rigid and more fluid kind of alignment rather than alliances policy with the Gulf.
I think that's a really smart and distinction that makes a lot of sense. One last quick question before I let you go. Kazakhstan, the latest country to join the Abraham Accords. Did you see that coming? What does that mean for the Middle East and for Central Asia?
Yeah, no, that was some exciting news. I know lots of people try to underplay that because they did have already established relationships with Israel. But I see it as, the first little crack in the door, that the Abraham Accord is no longer like exclusively Arab Israeli, but also moving into a more Muslim majority / Israeli integration and plan. I also see it as the fact that the Abraham Accords are still alive, and other people are willing to join, and the fact that the administration is aware that this is an important ideological framework to promote pan-Abrahamism as the basis of the stabilization of the broader Middle East, rather than revolutionary Islam, and to position U.S. interests and Israeli interests beyond the classical Middle East sphere. So very exciting, and I predict that others might join, especially Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan. I know from sources that they do express interest to actively join the Accords. So we'll hear some good news, hopefully before the end of the year.
Well, that's very exciting, and I think a really great way to wrap up the interview and wrap up this Friday episode of the Morning Brief. So thank you, Sarah Zaaimi, for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. Earlier this week, FDD hosted a media call during which our very own Jonathan Schanzer, Edmund Fitton Brown, and Bradley Bowman previewed Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's upcoming trip to Washington. MBS, as the Crown Prince is known, wants a defense pact from the US, maybe even advanced F-35 fighter jets, and billions more in economic deals. How should we make sense of all this, and what about Saudi-Israel normalization? John, Edmund, and Brad answered all this and more, so if you're curious to hear their takes on the upcoming visit, check out the transcript to get the lowdown. Meanwhile, my colleague Bridget Toomey is out with a piece in FDD's Long War Journal unpacking Iraq's 2025 parliamentary elections. Turnout was relatively high, 56% compared to about 41% in 2021, and the current party in power won the most votes. But Bridget explains that Iraq's current prime minister didn't gain enough seats to independently form a government and guarantee himself a second term. Iraq is now entering the government formation phase, so stay tuned to see how things shake out. And finally, check out FDD founder and president Cliff May's latest column in the Washington Times. Cliff tackles an issue that's recently become a focus for the Trump administration, the persecution of Christians in Nigeria. Little known fact about Cliff, he was an Africa correspondent for the New York Times way back when, so he knows more than a little bit about this issue. Cliff says that defending Christians against Islamists will require a sustained effort that combines all instruments of our national power. And with that, it's time to close this thing out. If you're looking for smart things to read over the weekend, check out the expert analysis on our website, fdd.org, and across our social media. And 'tis the season of giving and thanks, so please do support our work with a tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Monday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Your regular host, Jonathan Schanzer, will be back in the saddle. Thanks for letting me host you today. I'm Natalie Ecanow, signing off for FDD.